The federal government could announce details this week of a promised aid package for that sector after the global economy ground to a halt in response to COVID-19. Canadian oil prices went into a tailspin. A barrel of Alberta oil now sits at around $5. In March, the Fed said help was, quote, days away, hours away, the finance minister said at one point for the industry, but it's now mid-April. This weekend, major oil-producing countries reached a historic deal to cut production to help lift prices. But does Alberta still need significant support from Ottawa? Paula Simons is an independent senator from that province. She joins us from Edmonton. Hi, Senator Simons. Good to see you.
Good to see. Well, I can't see you, but I'm sure it would be lovely if I could.
Senator, I mentioned there sort of the tailspin we've seen with oil prices. It's been due to decreased demand, but also to a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. We saw a bit of that get resolved in that the price war is, I guess, officially over, but the prices haven't rebounded. They're still extremely low. When you talk about help for the oil sector as it pertains to Alberta, what would you like to see from the federal government?
You know, it's really interesting because, as you said, on March 25th, when Minister Morneau was in front of the Senate, he said there would be some kind of assistance within hours or days. So I was a little taken aback when the minister was back before the Senate on Saturday, and I was watching the live stream from Edmonton. And when he was asked about this, he said that there would be no specific assistance for the oil industry. He said that the assistance would be sector agnostic, which is not, I think, what people in Alberta had been led to believe or led to expect. There are still some significant challenges for producers here, especially for the junior oil producers who are doing conventional oil. The big, heavy oil players are a little bit more stable. But, you know, I think there isn't an expectation of a straight up bailout. I think everybody knows that that's politically unpalatable and economically not very viable. But I think people are still hopeful that maybe there will be some kind of support that allows more liquidity, that allows people to borrow, whether that's some kind of backstop or guarantee for borrowers. I think people have been very hopeful. Premier Kenney started talking about the idea of some kind of support for oilfield service workers to be doing cleanup of abandoned and orphaned wells, which would get people back to work and clean up an environmental hazard. So people are, I think, still hoping that there will be some kind of creative solution, although I don't think they're really expecting Ottawa to come riding to the rescue, like at the end of a movie.
If in fact the federal government does address the liquidity issue, does provide funds for the cleanup of orphan wells, but parcels it in a package that also addresses some of the other sectoral vulnerabilities, like in airlines and tourism. Those are the two the Prime Minister keeps mentioning in concert with the oil sector every time he's asked about this aid package. If they do address those two pillars, even though it's together with other stuff, is that okay?
Well, it would be okay for me. I am not an oil company. I mean, I think that's a reasonably pragmatic solution. And certainly the 75% wage backstop will help all kinds of companies, including oil and gas companies. But as you mentioned off the top, the problems in the industry aren't just about COVID-19 and the reduced demand. They're also about systemic problems with world oil prices. Right now, the Russians and the Saudis have come to a kind of a stalemate, having played chicken for the last month. But, you know, it's a reminder of just how vulnerable Canadian producers are to international forces that are completely outside our control. So, you know, would I like to see some kind of program that leads us towards a more stabilized market while at the same time helping us transition gradually towards a lower carbon economy? Absolutely. What disturbed me is that when I started tweeting about this on Saturday, I saw an awful lot of schadenfreude from people across Canada who sort of seem to think, well, you know, Alberta's had it so good for so long, they can just take this on the chin. It sort of serves them right. And I would point out to people that, you know, Alberta's energy sector doesn't just power Alberta's economy. It drives a lot of the federal economy and the federal exchequer at a time when we need money in the federal exchequer. So we don't want to cut off our noses to spite our faces. I would also say, although I represent Alberta, this is not just an Alberta problem. It's to an extent a Saskatchewan problem and to a huge degree a Newfoundland problem. Having Newfoundland default, you know, having Newfoundland go into the effective, receivership is not good for Canada either. So we need to come up with solutions that are transnational, that help all of our key sectors, but to sort of jeer at the oil sector at a time when we're all need to be united as a country is really peculiarly unhelpful.
And we have had Premier Ball on the show quite frequently over the past month, who's made similar pleas to the federal government. My understanding is around the cabinet table, at least, or within the federal government, there is some pushback on the appearance of subsidizing oil companies to any degree. You'd be familiar, of course, with the political debate around this. It's not as hyper-political as it is during, non-COVID-19 times, but it still does exist. What's your message to people who are worried about the appearance of subsidizing oil companies, despite, the hard hit the sector has just taken?
I mean, I don't think direct subsidies to oil companies would be the correct model in any event. But for people who think that we shouldn't support one of Canada's key industries at a time when A, we need energy security, and B, we need a functional economy, I mean, it's lovely to be idealistic. I understand that climate change is a real and pressing problem. I understand that we need to transition gradually away from a resource economy and from an economy that burns fossil fuels. But you can't transition by pushing somebody off a cliff. We need to have an intelligent, strategic response that puts aside political ideology and looks pragmatically at how we pick up the pieces when the COVID crisis is most acutely over, how we build an economy going forward, and how we help the oil and gas sector to transition towards cleaner alternatives. You don't do that by putting everybody into receivership and leaving behind an environmental cataclysm.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much, Senator Simons. Appreciate your time this evening.
My pleasure. Take care.